Hi everyone, Emma here. So today I want to talk about an MCA, Mental Capacity Assessment. So as many of you may know, my daughter she's 32 and she has Down syndrome, and recently we've been trying to get her a house, her own flat, and she's moved from one location to another. She's relocated from somewhere where we used to live to somewhere where we now live, and she was in supported living in the other place, and she chose to move up nearer where her family are. And so through the process of moving, and in this last year I've just learned a ton of stuff around rights, disability rights, the Care Act, mental health, human rights, all the acts, all the things. It's just been a bit of a nightmare. And she's had a couple of mental capacity assessments, and when she made a decision that she wanted to move closer to family where she was living, I had moved away. She decided she wanted to stay in her supported living, which is fine. It's her right to do that. And it got closed down. She was served a Section 21 notice, which meant she had 2 months to vacate the supported living house that she was in. And the care company that she was with were not going to find her another place to live, and so she was in a situation where she had to find another place to live. And because of that, and because it was like before in the past, she didn't want to move, she doesn't like change, reluctant to change, and so she stayed there because it was comfortable and nice. But since she was going to have to move anyway, we spoke, and it was like, right, well, do we want to take this opportunity to move where you're going to be closer to family, her sister, her nieces, me. And she decided that that is something that she wanted to do. Now, the social worker down there wanted to do a mental capacity assessment to see whether she had capacity to make that decision. Now, at the time, kind of like didn't know what I know now, and so just thought we had to just do that, and that's what the social services had asked for, and that's what we needed to do. And so the mental capacity assessment went ahead, and they said that she had capacity to make this decision for herself, and so that was fine. And then she moved up, and I mean, there's just a story, so many stories for another time. But she moved up, and she wasn't housed straight away. There was and so she lived with me for a good 10 months or something like that. And whilst we were battling to get her own place, and so the situation we found ourselves in was that, like, the housing association found her a place. There was a place found for her, and they wouldn't sort of move forward, because when they had spoken to the social worker had said, and they said, oh, is she fine to sign the tenancy agreement? Then the social worker said that she would have to do an MCA, a mental capacity assessment, to see whether she could sign the tenancy agreement. So the social worker contacted us to see if that could happen, and because I'd learned so much in a short space of time about rights and things, I then knew that, they couldn't just ask for a mental capacity assessment just because, it's like, oh, we need this, we're going to ask somebody. You know, imagine how it is when, like, you make a big major decision in your life, and every big major decision, like, somebody's saying, do you have mental capacity to make that decision? Are you smart enough to make that decision? Do you understand that decision? You know, on every single thing. And it's like, you know, at what point have you had enough mental capacity assessments to prove that you have the mental capacity to make decisions about your own life? You know, bearing in mind she'd not long had one. Because, like, previous to that, they wanted to do one previous to that to see whether she had mental capacity to make a decision about whether she could decide what type of housing that she wanted to live in once she'd moved here. So that was another one, and I said, well, no, she's literally just had one to see if she has mental capacity to make a decision about a move. You know, you're not doing another one. And they were like, oh, okay, fair enough, yeah. But then, you know, months later, they wanted to know whether she had the mental capacity to sign a tenancy agreement, bearing in mind that she'd already signed 2 tenancy agreements from previous tenancies that she'd had, and there was no great change in her diagnosis, I mean, or her mental health or anything to suggest. So, you know, I was pretty peeved that they were asking again, and, you know, didn't want to put her through that. Didn't want her to go through that. So I did some research on mental capacity and learned loads of super interesting things that I then want to share with you, in case you're going through something like that and they keep asking you to have a mental capacity assessment, or your son or daughter or person that you're advocating for or whatever. So, you know, did you know that mental capacity has to be assumed? So we don't come from a place of, mental capacity is not assumed. And that's, like, a really important thing, because, like, if we are to assume capacity, then we have to have good reasons to ask for a mental capacity assessment, and which is the right way round. You know, we need to be like saying, well, what are the reasonable doubts about capacity? And I think we need, as parents or carers or advocates, to be holding people, social services, accountable and asking them to provide us the reason why they think this person lacks capacity, instead of just simply going, oh yeah, okay, we'll jump through that hoop and you can do another mental capacity assessment. It's like, give me the reasons why you think this person doesn't have capacity. And the Care Act is really clear in that, I'm just going to pull it up here so I don't get it wrong. Hold on, sorry, 1 second. So what they cannot use to assume that you lack capacity is your diagnosis or disability. So just because you have a certain disability or diagnosis, that cannot be a reason to assume that you don't have capacity. They cannot use the fact that they feel that you're making an unwise decision, and the law, because the law says you've got a right to make your own decisions, and even if someone doesn't think that's a good decision, you know, you have the right to mess up and make wrong decisions. So that's not enough reason. You know, like moving into your own place, if they don't think that's a good idea for you, it's like, well, it's not a good enough reason for them to assume you lack capacity under the law. Your communication style, so, you know, if you're non-verbal, you can't just assume just because someone's non-verbal that they lack capacity of understanding, or, you know, they have speech impediments, or they take a long time to respond, or, you know, whatever, or British Sign Language, or need processing time. You know, you need to wait 10 minutes to get the answer, and just because that, you can't assume someone doesn't have capacity just because they're taking time. And also appearance and presentation. So, you know, how someone looks, what clothing they're wearing. You know, if a person's got Down syndrome, you know, their appearance, their disability, they wear their disability, it's on their face, and you know, you can't judge by that, and or by how hygienic they are, or how, you know, how messy they might be in their appearance. You know, you can't then go, oh well, because you're not looking after yourself, you lack capacity. You know, it's nothing to do with anyone else. It's like the law is really clear. And also, like, just because they disagree with the professionals doesn't mean to say they lack capacity either. Or, you know, or medical professionals, doctors or something like that. You know, you're allowed to challenge, you're allowed to have your opinion, and you're allowed to keep your autonomy. And so what they have to base it on is it must be shown that you're unable to do at least one of the following in relation to a specific decision. So, you know, if a capacity assessment was, if they wanted to do a capacity assessment to legally determine your capacity or lack of capacity, there's like things they need to follow. And we'll get onto that in a minute, but yeah, so you know, they can't just because you have a disability, a certain disability, because you're whatever in a wheelchair, because you've got like autism, or you know, some other diagnosis, they can't just like say, oh well, we think you lack mental capacity, without pointing out what the reasons are. And so in our situation, I, you know, said to the social worker, you know, what on what basis do you think, what makes you think, you know, you have to assume capacity, so what makes you think that she doesn't have capacity? And you know, they would write back and say, they wouldn't answer directly to that question. You know, I spoke with the social worker and with the social worker's manager, and they were just like, well, everybody is just like trying to make sure that they're safe, and you know, aren't like signing things that they don't understand, and it's for her legal protection. And you're just like, okay, great, thanks for that, but and they would say like, oh, you know, if something was to go to court, the first thing that the judge would ask for was a mental capacity assessment done. And you know, and I don't even know if that's real, and if it did go to court, then like what I would be saying to a judge is, you know, do you understand the law around like how we, like a mental capacity assessment, that a capacity has to be assumed, and so we assumed that this person had capacity based on this and this, and they've done their legal duty, they've assumed it, unless, you know, there's valid reasons to not believe that, in which case they could have done one. But you know, we can't just be in a position where people are just like, this is a go-to place for professionals, just so they've got this bit of paper and this backup, and not consider how that affects the person, in their own autonomy, in their self-esteem, in their rights to make decisions. You know, we can't just be undermining people with special needs or disability just because the powers that be want a piece of paper to tick box and to cover their own back. It's just not acceptable, and we need to stand up to these things. And I was recently in a meeting where like there were social workers and things like that, and we had this breakout room, and you know, she was saying that like, you know, there's a lot of pressure on her to get the MCAs, to just have it on file for their own well-being, and it's just not okay. And she was saying it's really hard because, you know, people above her are saying to get it. And so, you know, it's hard for the social worker that's coming out to your house because they're kind of just being told what they need, but really, you know, they need to be also reminding their managers that, you know, the law, what the Care Act says, what the law says. And as parents and advocates, we also need to be knowing our rights, knowing the rights of the people that we support, and questioning whether it's needed or not. And if it is needed, then these are the things that must be used to assess capacity. So to legally determine capacity, it must be shown that you are able to do at least one of the following in relation to a specific decision. And it's about a specific decision, not about like, you know, oh, this will cover you for a year. It's about a specific decision. And so it's to, can you understand relevant information? Can you retain the information long enough to make the decision? Can you use or weigh that information to make the decision? And can you communicate the decision by any means, you know, by pointing, by pictures, by signing, whatever. And if someone's suggesting that you lack capacity based on diagnosis, lifestyle, choices, appearance, you know, they're not following the law. So let me know if you've come up against anything like that in the comments, so we can have an open discussion about the state of play with things and how professionals are standardising things that, you know, are really not necessary when it comes to people with additional needs and disabilities. Okay. Hey, I also just want to add that, like, in this situation that we were in, where the housing association wouldn't let my daughter go to even visit the house or the flat because they didn't want her to get false hope about having it if she didn't have capacity to sign the tenancy agreement, which is just ludicrous on so many levels. Because even if she didn't have capacity, there would have been another way for her to sign a tenancy agreement, like having someone sign it on her behalf or something like that. But also, it's just like, it's ridiculous. And people in these like situations, you think they know what they're doing, but actually, when it comes to some people and disabilities and things like that, they actually don't know what they're doing. And like over and over I was told, like, oh, I'm way out of my depth, I don't know. And they don't know the law, they haven't been in this situation before, and they're telling you, and they're trying to like make themselves like they're professional and they know what they're doing, but they actually sometimes don't know the law. And even if they're following their own policies and like housing association policies or council policies, doesn't necessarily mean that the policy is lawful. So in this situation, it's like we were due to go and look around the flat, and then they phoned up on the morning of to say, no, you can't look around the flat because I've spoken to the social worker and she needs to do a mental capacity assessment, so we're going to cancel the viewing on the flat, which is just horrendous because, you know, it's like, right, okay, well, she might not even want the flat. The flat might be rubbish and she might not even want it, in which case the mental capacity assessment isn't even needed. So she needs to see the flat even before, and you know, she's a big grown-up person, and if it turns out that false hope is given and you can't have the flat for whatever reason, then you cope with that like anyone else copes with that. You know, I've wanted loads of flats or houses in my time and not got them, and you've got to cope with that. And it's like, we got starved people of life experiences just because they've got special needs or disability. It's like, what? It's like indirect discrimination. It's discrimination. It's weird. Anyway, so that was not right. And the fact that like, and also like that housing is separate from care, and really the landlord, which is the housing association in this situation, is nothing to do with them, actually. Like, yeah, capacity to sign the tenancy agreement, and whether she can do that for sure is something to do with them. But like, you know, they should come to me and say, you know, with a reasonable doubt, you know, like when they phoned up the social worker and said, oh, does she have mental capacity to sign the tenancy agreement? You know, why could the social worker not say to them, well, what reasonable doubts do you have about that? And, you know, do you know that we can't just do an MCA? We have to assume capacity unless you have a reasonable doubt. So you, housing association, what is your reasonable doubt around this? Considering that, you know, you've spent an hour or so with the person, could you not figure it out yourself? You know, what are your reasonable doubts? Did you just assume that just because she had Down syndrome, perhaps, which is unlawful? You know, why aren't the social workers challenging that and teaching people? Or why don't the housing association even know that they cannot just ask for an MCA just because they then also just want one to cover their own back? And so like the whole thing is a bit weird. So I'm like thinking, you know, when a housing association does like maybe phone up a social worker and ask for that, you know, I feel that why doesn't the social worker say, well, it has to be assumed, so can you tell me your reasonable doubts as to why that you think that's a good idea? And, you know, have you done anything to assuage those doubts? Have you been and spoken to the person? Have you gone through the tenancy? Have you provided an easy read and asked them to look at it and then gone back to them to speak about whether they understand it? To assuage the reasonable doubt, you know, do the legwork, do the work before you're coming to me or putting a person through the assessment. You know, should it not be on the shoulders of the professionals to do the legwork, to do the work, to do whatever they can to not put that person in the situation where they have to have their capacity undermined or questioned? So, you know, the onus should be on, I think in this letter I wrote, is like, you know, I also feel that if a social worker can't identify for themselves the reasonable doubt, then surely the simple response to a request is that, to the best of my knowledge, there are no reasonable doubts about capacity. I wrote that I feel this should be on the onus of the querying party rather than the person doing an MCA just because and as a standard practice, and that for the person with the learning disability, it could be humiliating, like I've said. And I feel that organisations need to tread with more caution and do their own due diligence, rather to gather information and be able to clearly identify why capacity is in doubt before jumping in to put someone through it. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of add that in. Okay, bye for now.